Yeah.
Is that in the Summer Palace, by
Summer,
the way?
yes. Yes.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
the the outdoor walkway. I like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
And it's long, it's
Yeah,
a long walkway. So
yeah,
and the
yeah.
all the paintings throughout, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm.
Okay, but like I said, it shouldn't affect our time. If I need to change time,
No,
I'll contact
you
you.
let me know. You will let me
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
Absolutely. Well, you'll be in Beijing.
Yeah, I will mainly just visiting my parents. They're getting
Excellent.
old, so I use the cheap ticket
Mm,
right now. It's a slow season, so it's a ticket is
no.
good. So I just go whenever I can. Yeah.
Tell me, as somebody who has read massively on old Chinese history, is there still the strong feeling of connection between parents and children in China that was such an important part of Chinese culture before?
Yes, and there's still it's just still common. Like when children get
Mm,
married, they live with their parents. It's still common.
right.
Not as common as it's used to, in particular
Yeah.
big cities, and for various
Mm,
reasons. And when people leaving their, villages or small towns, and then then their parents and children are living separately. But if they are in the same city, it's there you can still see certain parts of China that's pretty common. And so,
mm.
yeah, and then, my parents, for example, they still like to get into my business, sometimes for good, sometimes not so good. So,
I can imagine. Yes, I can
so
imagine.
yeah,
Anyway, here I am. Here we are.
in particular, my mother, I would say she's totally fine. I'm here, far away from her. But as
Yeah,
soon as I'm, visiting her, she want to arrange
yeah,
everything for me. Like I can't
yeah,
handle things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. One of the things, by the way, that I've had to explain many times to Westerners, is that if you talk about Chinese history, one of the most striking things about it, especially compared with the medieval and early modern history of the West, is how many extremely strong women there
Mhm.
have been in Chinese history. And by the way, how very strong I understand women have been within families, just to say,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
especially mothers,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
also say.
Yeah, not least in the royal families. The mothers of the
Absolutely.
king, of the emperor.
Yeah,
They trying to get into the business, and there is
absolutely.
actually a real emperor, right? Wu
Yeah,
Zetian during the Tang Dynasty.
that's right.
She's also very controversial because she's not part of the Li family, the royal
Yeah,
family, but she has a
yeah.
different family name. But nonetheless, she was mother of the emperor, and then eventually she became the empress herself. So,
Absolutely, and as I said, a great ruler apparently, and
yeah.
a rather terrifying figure, and a very important person in terms of art and culture, and of course, I don't know. Have you ever heard of Judge D? He's a sort of
Judge D.
Judge D, Chinese. He's based on an actual Chinese scholar
Uh-huh.
official of the Tang period,
Yeah.
but in the 1950s and 60s, a Dutch um, scholar who loved China very very much
Hmm.
and knew China very well. Anyway, he wrote a whole series of detective stories
Hmm.
based on this man,
Yeah.
in which he presented him as having being an official in various Chinese towns, all invented, by the way. And he
Well,
created all kinds of stories about these detective feats. And of course, they happened during the time of Wu Zetian's reign.
yeah, Di Renjie, I think the original person's name, he is a real official, high official
Mm,
working
yeah,
for Wu Zetian.
mm,
And Wu
that's it.
Zetian like him because he's not part of the royal family. He actually
Mm,
coming from grassroots, from
mm,
commoner. That background, actually, Wu Zetian likes that. And during
yeah,
her time, it's because she herself is kind of like do not want to be controlled by the royal family. She
mm,
likes to promote people from the grassroots, those people,
there
regular
you go.
people. Yeah. So that's interesting aspect of her ruling. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay. Let's start with the election. So Georgia just had election, and can we say that the West failed trying to duplicate what happened in 2014, the Maidan coup. Can we say that?
So far, yes, and I think they're going to continue to fail. First of all, I think I should just say that I've been in touch with many people, including many people from Georgia. I mean, Greeks and Georgians have very strong connections with each other. We have a history of interaction that goes back to about, well, the equivalent, the exact historical time would be the time of the Warring States in China. So that gives you an idea of how long our interactions have been. The Georgian people are a major presence in Greek mythology, for example, just to say. So I know a lot of people from Georgia. I've had a lot of contacts with people in Georgia. They all tell me the same thing. The election was genuine. The result is what is being reported. The Georgian political party that won, the Georgian government that won decisively, and that it has the strong support of most people in Georgia, including at least half the population of Tbilisi, which is the capital where the Western opposition is most strongly based. So what they are all saying is that if there is an attempt to reproduce in Georgia a kind of color revolution dynamic that we saw in Ukraine in 2014, what that would do is that it would trigger a consolidation of Georgian society behind the government, that in effect people in Georgia voted against the kind of political change that these forces support and want to carry out in Georgia.
And also in general, I feel like elections getting more and more complicated, turbulence in a way. Of course, the Ukraine election, we know it was a legitimate election, and then later overthrown the elected president Yanukovych. And then in 2018, the election in Venezuela, U.S. didn't recognize that, right? They recognized the Juan Guaido, who I don't see any legitimacy of that, but U.S. recognized him. And they even confiscated the Venezuela embassy in Washington and give the power to Juan Guaido to control that. I think they give it back to Nicolas Maduro's government last year. But anyway, and then of course the 2020, the US election didn't go very smoothly. So it seems like more and more we see elections that do not go very smoothly, or people do not recognize results. Is that what's going on right now?
That is absolutely what is going on right now, and of course, one has to understand that this isn't completely surprising, because of the extent to which elections now take place in two places simultaneously at one and the same time. So we're talking about an election in Georgia or an election in Venezuela or an election everywhere. There is the actual election which takes place in the country where people vote and they put their ballots then and decide whom they support. That's one election. And then simultaneously, there is the election that's conducted in the Western media, within the Western commentary class, within the Western intellectual community. And there they are always commenting and discussing and also participating in the election. And of course, the results can be completely different. So the people in one country, let's say Georgia, might vote strongly in favor of one government, of a particular government, but the people who are participating in their own kind of way, remotely in the election, in the media and wherever in the West, they might be voting, in effect, I say voting in quotation marks, for a completely different political force, for an opposition that is connected to them. And of course, what they say, the people in the West say, is that it is their view of the election outcome which must prevail. It is their view which is the legitimate one, not the one of the people who actually voted in the country in question. So obviously that creates complexity and tension, not least in the country itself. And what we saw in the United States in 2020 is the inevitable result of all of this. Because the same doubts and uncertainties and tensions between what the commentariat and the political elite in the West, the outcome they want and the outcome that people actually vote for, inevitably that has ended up being played out in the United States itself. Because, of course, if you go and do this sort of thing in all kinds of other countries, sooner or later, all of that's going to be imported back to your own.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what happened in 2020 is the direct result. Remember, I think in 2019 is what was happening in Hong Kong. The rioters, I mean, there is no better way to describe them. The so-called freedom fighters, right? The students, they attacked the government building. They did. And then I think shortly before that, it was something also, Belarus also had something. Also, people who are unhappy with the government. I mean, there is always somebody who's not happy with the government, right? They also, I think, did something similar. And then the CNN and all the other news media, they praises these kind of behavior. They think that's a good thing. Well, then the people in the US watched the 24 hours of this kind of thing. Well, if they are not happy with the results, of course, they feel like, well, we should do something too, right? I think it has a lot to do with it. But
absolutely. That's entirely my view. I mean, if you meddle and interfere and manipulate and control political and electoral processes in other places, or try to do so, then inevitably, sooner or later, all of that is going to be imported back into your own country. And of course, it's important to say, both in the United States and in other Western countries, that the kind of political technologies and the kind of people who are there orchestrating on the ground these events, including, by the way, in Hong Kong, well, of course, they come back to the United States itself, and they do them back in the United States or in Britain or anywhere else. It is the nature of politics. You can't be bad outside and good internally. The world isn't like that. You can't go around, subverting democracy, or let's not even talk about democracy. Subvert normal, lawful political process in one place and assume that it won't happen to your own place, because the people who do the one, on your behalf, will say, well, if we can do it in Hong Kong, why shouldn't we do it here?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Japan had election, a local, a parliamentary election, which the Liberal Democratic Party, they didn't get the majority of the seats, which I guess somewhat surprising. What is your take on that?
No, it is not surprising. Again, this is, in fact, to some extent, I was relieved by it, not just because of the result itself, which is a relief, but because it is actually consistent with what I used to hear from the kind of people that, 20, 30 years ago from Japan, I used to have dealings with, who used to tell me that, there are an awful lot of people in Japan who do not agree with this style of politics and the kind of people who do these kind of things. And they pointed out that when there were brief elections in the 1930s, it turned out even then that there was more opposition than the emperor and his regime were happy with, which is why all that had to be rolled back and why massive indoctrination campaigns were then launched. And it seems it's the same with Japan now. So I think the reason is very straightforward. I mean, we've had a period of relative economic stability in Japan. I mean, things have not been going especially well, but then they haven't been going especially well for a long time. But there are people in Japan who do understand that the policy that is being followed by the Japanese government over the last couple of years, very anti-China, very militaristic, very seeking confrontation, pursuing sanctions, doing all of these things, is not in Japan's interests. And they say, why? Why should we support these things? And enough of them voted to make a difference. Now, notice, by the way, that the coalition party that supports the Liberal Democrats is Komeito. Now, I used to know quite a few people, oddly enough, from Komeito for some reason. I mean, it's very much based around a Buddhist movement, which, to be frank, I didn't understand or especially like. But the point about Komeito in those days, we're talking about long ago, is that it was very, very strongly opposed to Japanese militarism and Japanese rearmament, and supported what was then conceived of as the peace constitution that Japan had. All of that seems to have fallen by the wayside. And I wouldn't be surprised also if Komeito, which seems to have shrunk a lot in size over the last 20 years, has also lost support because of its complete reversal of its policies that it used to have when it originally existed and when I once upon a time knew about it. So these results do not surprise me. How much difference in the end they're going to make, unfortunately, is another matter, because as we always see, in country after country that's allied with the United States, an election may say one thing, the people may want something, but what the power does is more based on what Washington wants.
Yeah, I agree. I think it won't make much of a difference either way. Yeah, I agree. A few visits. Let's start with the foreign minister, British foreign minister David Lammy. He visited China not that long ago. So what was the goal, and did he achieve the goal? What do you think?
Well, this is a fascinating story because, of course, if you wouldn't know about the fact that he visited China by following the British media. I mean, I can follow the Chinese media. I know that he was there. But as I said, the British media has basically very much downplayed it. The only newspaper here that's covered it at all is the Daily Telegraph, which is viscerally anti-Chinese, and which went on and on and on about David Lammy appeasing the Chinese and bending the knee and all that nonsense. The thing to understand is that Britain is in an economic hole. As we are making this program, the British government is unveiling its budget, which is going to announce tax increases of £40 billion. That's around $60 billion. Just to give some sense of what we're talking about, which for a country like Britain is a huge tax increase. And remember, we're a heavily taxed country already. So people are very, very angry. The economy is in a very, very bad way. There is a colossal crisis of investment. Investment in Britain is the lowest in all the G20 countries. And it's been like that for a very long time. We're falling behind technologically. If you're talking about major British industrial brands, the only one I can think of that exists at all is Rolls-Royce, which is the aircraft producer, not the car manufacturer, which is German. It's the Rolls-Royce cars are owned by BMW in Germany. But even Rolls-Royce, the aerospace maker, is losing ground. It's not produced a new engine for a very long time. We're apparently strong in a few niche products because we've got lots of rock groups and pop stars and all of that in Britain. We make rather good sound systems. This is a sort of cottage industry with people working in attics and screwing things together, but nobody takes that very particularly seriously. So we are in a very difficult mess in Britain. Now, the previous Conservative government, when it was led by David Cameron, saw that and they said, look, what are we going to do? We've got to try and attract foreign investment. Let's position Britain as a strong partner of China, which is the country with the enormous industrial and technological strengths. Let's work with the Chinese in terms of some of their banking projects. Let's forge a golden age of policy with China. It was a plan. Then, of course, David Cameron left the scene. The Conservatives then swung back and took an incredibly pro-American, pro-Atlanticist, anti-Chinese line. The media followed. All of that was thrown away. The economy continued its increasingly rapid decline. And the new Starmer government has come in and it's found itself looking at this terrible situation. And they say, well, maybe David Cameron at least got something right. So they sent David Lammy to Beijing. The trouble is, David Lammy, by all accounts, is an extremely poor diplomat. I mean, he's got no background in diplomacy whatsoever. He's not considered to be a particularly sophisticated or intellectual or intelligent man. And I have to say, the idea of putting him up and expecting him to conduct an effective dialogue with Chinese officials, people like Wang Yi, I mean, no one in Britain takes that idea seriously. So he's not a strong figure to send to Beijing. What this situation calls for is to get a proper dialogue resumed, to have Starmer himself, the Prime Minister, come to China at the head of a very, very strong delegation of business people and people from the academic world and scientists and industrialists, to the extent that we have them. What Angela Merkel used to do on behalf of Germany, that kind of thing, and try to forge a proper long-term relationship with China in the way, as I said, that Merkel, to some extent, successfully achieved with China. Nobody in Britain thinks in that way. Starmer doesn't. Starmer at the moment is very nervous about embracing China in that sort of way. But there is another factor, which is, of course, the British are worried about the American election. The relationship between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer is very bad and going to get even worse because Starmer stupidly meddled in the American election. It could be that the British, even though they don't want to particularly go to China, they might have to do that, and Starmer might very well find himself obliged to go to Beijing in the kind of way that I said. But he won't do it. He won't be comfortable doing it in the way that Merkel was comfortable doing it. And there'll be an awful lot of resistance still in Britain from all the usual Atlanticist crowd who are always going to be there, always criticizing, always speaking out against things like that, even when the imperative need for it is obvious for everyone to see.
Why do they always say, like Johnson and the Starmer probably, why do they always feel like they have to pick a side? Why can't they have a good relationship with the US and with China? I mean, what is the thing that makes them feel like they have to pick a side? Why?
Well, I've asked myself that question so many times. Why did Britain have to poison its relationship with Russia so completely? I mean, bear in mind, I mean, I know Russia much better than I know China, but I can say for a fact that Britain always had historically a rather good image, positive image in Russia. After all, the British never conquered Russia. They didn't go to Russia and burn down the imperial palace there. So, the Russians didn't have that issue. I mean, they like to read Sherlock Holmes stories and put on Shakespeare plays and drink British, Scottish whiskey and do all of that sort of thing. And yet now, if you go to Russia, you speak to the Russians, they think of Britain as a complete enemy state. And I mean, it's universally seen in those terms. China, where the relationship was very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of history, but the Chinese were prepared to put that to one side. We had, as I said, that brief period under Cameron when things appeared to be going really, really well, and then we threw it all away. Why? Why do we do this to ourselves all the time? Well, I think ultimately it comes down to this. The British have still not put behind them this imperialist concept that they developed in the 18th and 19th century. They still have that yearning to play a big global geopolitical role. And of course, since they don't have the power to do that on their own that makes them draw to the Americans who speak the same language as they do and who think are more similar to Britain than they really are. And they end up, in effect, not just echoing what the Americans say and think and do, but going even further in order to impress the Americans with their own loyalty and their own part in this joint project. And, you know, if you listen to people like Boris Johnson, he talks about the need to preserve Western hegemony, for example. He actually talks like this.
And Annalena Baerbock talking about Germany, right? Merkel. She's in China now. I think. First of all, I don't know why is she there. It's not clear to me at all why she's there. And then, of course, when she's there, nobody even greeted her at the airport, which is very different. Angela Merkel got lots of respect in China, you know, because of what you just said. And with Baerbock, on the one hand, that she's calling Xi Jinping dictator, all that sort of thing. At the same time, you know, she's keep on going to China. What is she doing?
Well, you know, this is a good example of the mess that we are in Europe, because I mean, Germany, more even than any other European country, needs to sort out its relations with China and do so urgently. Germany's in a major economic crisis. Volkswagen is about to close 3 of its factories in Germany. Now, unless you know Germany well, which I do, you cannot fathom what a shock that is going to be in the German psyche. I mean, Volkswagen is seen as an absolute core company in Germany. You know, the whole German psyche is built around the auto industry, and Volkswagen is at its core. I am hearing of major problems in Daimler as well. You know, the people who make the Mercedes cars. I don't want to talk about that because I was provided this information last night confidentially, so I can't describe what it is, but it looks awful. So Germany in spiraling industrial decline. Now, Germany was propped up for many years by 3 things. Firstly, the Germans themselves were very good at doing an awful lot of the things that they did. I mean, you know, they were very skilled at engineering. You know, they had those innate skills. Secondly, they had a good relationship with the Russians. They imported cheap gas and cheap oil, and not just those things, but many other things as well. And some German leaders, far-sighted German leaders like Gerhard Schröder, used to speak of Russia becoming Germany's economic hinterland. In other words, the 2 economies would work together, and that would provide economies of scale and would enable Germany to develop its industrial strength in that kind of way. And the third, which is absolutely crucial and must not be underestimated, was that Germany had a very, very good relationship developed over many years, cultivated by Angela Merkel with China. And all of that, again, has been thrown into chaos. So Germany is not investing in new technologies because the German industrial system at some point lost its way. Germany has knocked away its relationship with Russia. It's not getting cheap cheap oil. It's lost its massive investments in Russia. All of that, you know, the prospect of developing the economic hinterland, that's all gone. There's just the thread of the relationship with China that's left. And that is fraying. We've had this disastrous decision to impose tariffs on Chinese EVs, which Germany voted against and was overruled over. So they've got to try and find some kind of a way to work out a relationship with China. And German industry knows this. So they're pressing the German government. They're saying, look, we've got to find some kind of means to work towards some kind of understanding with China. We need it. We need to form industrial partnerships. Perhaps conceivably one day we might even need the Chinese to help us rebuild our relationship with the Russians. All of that. But then what do? They send Annalena Baerbock, who is not interested in any of these things, doesn't really understand them, and isn't even liked in China, because the political system in Germany is incapable of giving any alternative answer. It's not able to put up anyone else. So, instead of Scholz sending, somebody from the industrial or economic systems, maybe the head of the Bundesbank or someone like that to do those negotiations, he has to send Baerbock, because if he doesn't, then that will create problems within the coalition, because you'll be angry and the Greens will be angry and there'll be tensions, and all the Atlanticist media in Germany will start raising outcries and all that kind of thing. So they send Baerbock, which ensures that any dialogue between Germany and China is going to fail. And it's not going to fail because the Chinese don't like her. They don't like her, but the Chinese are very practical people. If she was, screwed together, if she knew how to conduct negotiations, if she was interested in all of these things, they would talk to her, but as they talk to everybody, it will fail because Baerbock herself isn't interested in these things. She's not interested in talking about industrial partnerships and technical things. She has no background in this. It's not what she talks or thinks about. So she comes to China with no delegation to speak of. She walks down the plane, and it's not just the case that there's nobody there to receive her. Even more striking for me is that she comes down the plane and she's by herself. She's not brought anybody with her to really conduct serious discussions. So the Chinese say, well, why should we waste our time?
It's pretty astounding, I have to say, that I don't know, even the German ambassador wasn't there. It seems like, I mean, nobody seems even pay attention to what she's doing. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't help that I think most people now, even in Germany, think that we're in the final months of this government. I mean, there's going to be elections next year. Nobody expects the government to be re-elected. So nobody expects Baerbock to be foreign minister for much longer. So, I mean, in a sense, she's already a fading figure. But I mean, put that aside, if you really wanted to change the political dynamic in Germany, you'd have sent someone else. But nobody did.
Also, the Finland president, he's visiting China now. He seems is doing what you're saying that Britain should be doing. He brought with him a delegation, a business delegation, a sizable one. So he's there just to talk about trade. Is that what his goal is?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. Finland is in a very similar situation in some ways to Germany and Britain. In the sense that, of course, their very strong economic relations used to be with Russia, and they've all fallen apart. But they do seem to have a better understanding that, as I said, trying to build up some kind of relationship with China is imperative for them. And that's why presumably they've gone. I wasn't aware of this, actually.
Yeah, he's there right now. Yeah, I think he went to China like 2 days ago. He's there. I think he's still there. Yeah. Right. Visiting Shanghai now. He was in Beijing and then now he's in Shanghai. So it does seem like a business trip, business-oriented trip.
Yes.
Okay. Another person interesting that visited China recently is John Mearsheimer. So he was, I believe, invited by Tsinghua University to give a speech, and then followed with some panel discussions. So he's, I would say, kind of a controversial figure in China, because there are plenty of people online very critical of him because he has been talking about contain China. But when he was there in Tsinghua University, the students and the people who were hosting him, they were all very warm towards him. I think part of it is he believes that containing China is necessary for the US, but he also not blaming China for what China
No,
is doing, building up
no.
its military, its industry, those sort of thing. So is it fair to say that he is in the school of this Thucydides trap thinking? Is that kind of his thinking that he agrees with this theory? Can we say
I
that?
think I think he is a more sophisticated thinker than be simply following mechanically the Thucydides trap type thing. By the way, I mean I should say something. I mean we discussed Mearsheimer some time ago,
Mm-hmm.
and the important thing to say about Mearsheimer is he has a theory of international relations,
Mm-hmm.
and I've explained why I don't agree with his perspectives on the
Mm-hmm.
relationship between China. I think he doesn't, I think, understand that there are differences between China and the way in which the European powers behave and have historically behaved. I think he, assumes that the
Mm-hmm.
whole world works in that kind of way, and I think it doesn't. And I think Chinese history shows that. But he has none of that antagonism
Mm-hmm.
to a country. It's just that he thinks that in international relations are always about power. Ultimately, it's about that they're about power relations,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very common view, by the way. I mean, so he doesn't come to China with any antipathy to China. And I mean, I should say this. I mean, I've discussed China with him,
Mm-hmm.
and he even told me once that actually, he's aware about him being. This was before his
Yeah.
recent visit, that he's very, very well received in China,
Mm-hmm.
and that people like him there, and that
Mm-hmm.
he's taken very seriously in China. In fact, he didn't say this to me. I'm not putting words into his mouth. He didn't say that he's taken more seriously in China than he is in the United States. But I almost
But
got
it's true.
that sense that that is what he
Yeah.
thinks. Anyway, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, there we go. So, but the Thucydides trap is something that is being harped on and talked about in the West in terms of the relations between the United States and China all the time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
every single newspaper in Britain has published articles, not just one article, lots of articles about this. You read about it in the United States also. I should say the Americans even more, because classics studies are much more prevalent in the US than they are in Europe any longer, surprising as that may seem. But lots of Americans, especially Americans in the military for some reason, seem to be very familiar with and very interested in ancient Greek and Roman history and what the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and historians wrote. So
Before you
there is a go on.
first of all, sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt you. Can you explain what Thucydides
Yeah,
trap
yeah,
is?
I will absolutely.
Okay.
Let me explain exactly what it is. So
Yeah.
this comes from Greek history, and you've got to understand that Greece is a very small part of the world. Um, in Western civilization, it has an absolutely disproportionate degree of importance, because Greece was the first part of Europe to actually become civilized and to develop a proper civilization, and a very powerful civilization with tremendous philosophy and intellectual things and all sorts of things. Now, around the time of the Warring States, at the time of the Zhou dynasty, I mean, we're talking about, the equivalent period is the Zhou
Mm-hmm.
dynasty in China. The ancient Greek world possessed two great powers. One was Athens,
Mm-hmm.
which is today the capital of Greece. The other was Sparta, which is a city in the south of Greece. Today, if you wanted to go from one to the other, it's a day's drive. I mean, I've done it many times, but in the time of the ancient world, these are big distances, and each of them were enormously powerful. Sparta historically had been the more powerful country.
Mm-hmm.
It was the biggest power in Greece. It had the most powerful army, and it had an aristocratic, conservative political system. Athens was the newer, rising power, dynamic. It was a merchant, maritime city. It began to rise. Now, these two cities ended up fighting each other, and there was a prolonged war, which is as important in Greek history as any of the wars between the warring states are for the people of China. And over the course of that war, which Sparta won and Athens lost, a historian appeared who is as important in Greek history as Sima Qian is in China. And this is Thucydides. Thucydides was an Athenian politician and general. He was a commander of the Athenian forces. He was defeated by the Spartans. He went into exile, and he decided that he would write the history of the war. And he used scientific methods to write that history, which were of a quality and a accuracy that it is fair to say no Western historian achieved any time after until the late 19th century. So he is an incredibly important intellectual figure. Now, he wrote this book, which is often referred to as the Peloponnesian War, and it is one of the great texts of ancient Greek civilization. It's one of the key texts, which he describes the war in phenomenal accuracy. And at the beginning, he has a war in which he discusses the causes of the war between Athens and Sparta. And he then gives a long list of the various things that the Athenians and the Spartans argued about, what the one did and what the other did and what they didn't agree with, and all of which eventually led to the war. And then he has this very famous passage in which he said that these are the reasons why these countries said they went to war. Mm-hmm. But the underlying reason was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. So Sparta had been the more powerful country. Athens was the rising country. The Spartans saw Athenian power increase. That made them afraid, and this led to the war. Now, many people in the West, in fact, it's not just many people, it's the predominant view in intellectual circles, believe that Thucydides was writing a history in which he wanted to set out universal rules about human affairs. Mm-hmm. And what he was saying was that in a situation where there are two powers, one is rising relative to the other, that is going to inevitably result in a crisis, and that will lead to a war between the two. So to use the analogy of recent Western history, Britain used to be the dominant power. It saw Germany rise, and that is why there was wars between Britain and Germany. And during the Cold War, the US was the dominant power. It looked as if the Soviet Union was going to rise. That was why there was Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what they're saying today is it's the same today between the United States and China. The United States is the great power. China is the rising power. There is inevitably going to be a conflict between the two. A war is going to arise because of the rise of Chinese power and the fear this is causing in America. Now, the trouble is, all of these people who say this don't speak Greek. I speak Greek. I am absolutely imbued with Thucydides. And he didn't mean it in that way at all. He was not writing general rules about international affairs. On the contrary, if you read him carefully, he goes out of his way to make clear that always there are choices. There was no reason why Sparta needed to fear Athens, or that Athens needed to go to war with Sparta. It was absolutely the result, the product of bad decisions made in both of these countries. He would have completely rejected any suggestion that this is an iron rule that must be applied, right across international relations, because he was a passionate believer, and passionate is not an overstatement, in human agency and in the role of political leaders in making decisions. So he would have said there is no such thing as a Thucydides trap. Talking as if there is simply a way to reject your own responsibility for decisions which are simply going wrong. And he would have looked at the situation today, if he was around today. He was one of the most intelligent men that we have ever produced in the West. And he would have said, look, there's the United States, there is China. There is no fundamental incompatibility between the two. Yes, there are points of tension, but there is no reason why these can't be negotiated and sorted out and settled peacefully. And there is no iron rule that says that because China is rising, that must mean that America and China must go to war with each other.
This is very interesting. Sounds to me like Thucydides himself would want to avoid Thucydides trap, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, he, as I said, he was someone. If you read his book, I mean, one of the most interesting things is that he is very, he's not particularly religious. It's one of the strange facts. So he rejects completely any deterministic or mystical approach to history. He says that always human agency in international relations is decisive. And he's repeatedly talking, he often talks about, this political leader, that's wise and statesman-like. He talks like this about Pericles, the Athenian leader, or Brasidas, the Spartan leader, for example. Others are not so. They're demagogic. They look and create all kinds of problems, and they inspire people to do all sorts of terrible things. And there's a lot of criticism of leaders like this. But what people do, as I said, they take these isolated phrases in Thucydides and they construct entire philosophical systems around him, which is absolutely the view which he would have categorically rejected.
Yeah, the people who are championing for this are the people saying this is unavoidable. This trap,
exactly,
this trap is unavoidable. Whereas he himself wants to see things happen differently to avoid that trap. So that's very ironic. I find it very interesting.
It is extremely ironic because a lot of the people who say that that we are in a Thucydides trap, and that a conflict between China and the United States is unavoidable. This is the thing to understand, is that they want a conflict between the United States and China. And they're using Thucydides to say, well, whether you want it or not, it's going to happen. I mean, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Which isn't true. It's not what he said at all.
Yeah. Well, then Mearsheimer's view then seems like a kind of agrees with it somewhat, but then he thinks the way to avoid that is to contain China, to not let China continue to rise, right? That's his solution.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, his view. I mean, that's why I said he's not. I mean, he's far too sophisticated a person to fall into the error of what we just talked about. I mean, he wants to avoid conflict with China. I think that's the thing to understand about Mearsheimer. His objective is to avoid war. But he believes that in order to avoid war, you need to practice deterrence and containment. I think that is wrong. The way to avoid conflict and war is, on the contrary, to practice cooperation and friendship. And I think that is, by the way, much closer to Thucydides' thinking than to one of these nonsense people who invented the Thucydides trap.
It's very interesting. Okay, now
Yeah.
finally it's clear to me. All right. I mean, I actually thought that was what Thucydides meant, right? That this is
No.
unavoidable. So
Yes.
okay.
You see, can I just give another example of? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a Thucydides becomes extremely critical of the policies of his own city of Athens, which becomes increasingly aggressive and increasingly brutal. And there's a very famous incident which he describes in great detail, in which the Athenians crush an island city called Melos, because Melos rebelled against them, and the Athenians came and they killed all the men and they sold all the women and children into slavery. And I mean, it's clear that he's profound. If you read it, he's profoundly shocked by it. He thinks this is terrible and cynical thing. Anyway, he gives the Athenians a quote when they're explaining what they're going to do to the Melians, in which the Athenians tell the Melians that of men we know and of the gods we believe, that the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must. And many people assume that this was Thucydides' own belief. Absolutely not. He's criticizing this because, of course, it's this policy of increasing aggressiveness and brutality that Athens follows, promoted by political leaders in Athens, that he strongly criticizes, which eventually turn the whole of Greece against Athens and lead to its defeat. So again, people are not reading him correctly.
Yeah. And speaking of which, US is doing containment, as much as they can. So the latest one is the US will ban outbound investments in China's semiconductors, quantum technologies, and AI. So from January 2nd. I think this is executive order that has been issued by Biden some time ago, but now it's finalized. So the Treasury Department, I think they got out some detailed rules about this. So that's the one thing. But I always feel like these kind of thing, I can see why they do that. But at the same time, again, I feel this could also potentially hurt the dollar, because these are investment. We're talking about dollar investments. So I always feel like the best way to protect dollar is to make dollar available and convenient for people to use. But when you say you cannot invest here, you cannot invest that, you limit dollars investment, isn't it?
That's exactly correct. That's exactly what you're doing. You are, again, using the dollar as a mechanism for international economic war. You are, in fact, waging economic war, because this is what this is all about, trying to block the development of China's semiconductor industry. It's ultimately, it's not even containment in the end. It is economic warfare. And then you are horrified and astonished that people no longer trust your currency anymore and won't trade with you, and look for ways to develop other global systems and trading systems to try and avoid you. But that's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, but they will continue to do so. I think they will continue.
Absolutely no.
Yeah, even though it doesn't make any sense, but
Yeah.
Because it's not going to stop the investment in China. I mean, China has money, and you can use other currencies to buy things when you're talking about investment, right? So I don't see how that can be really hurting China, right?
It is not going to hurt China. It is going to stimulate development of a further branch of the Chinese economy in a way that the United States, in the end, is going to struggle to compete with. I mean, that's what it's going to do. I mean, all you have to look is at the scale. I mean, China has greater investment opportunities, great investment resources than the United States does. This is something, by the way, the Americans find very difficult to understand, because up to now, in any given situation, they've always been able to outspend someone, whoever it is they're up against. But China can actually outspend them if it must, and it, and this it will. And of course, China has far greater industrial and technological resources, and at least equivalent scientific ones. So, I mean, they'll be able to do this, and they'll be able to do this very fast. By 2030, we'll be looking at a completely different situation.
The other thing is also I think related to US, even though this is Switzerland. So the Bank of International Settlement, BIS, is now considering shutting down its mBridge project. mBridge is a CBDC, right? The central bank direct currency exchange mechanism. Well, what's interesting is, first of all, the whole thing, I think it was reportedly the way they reported is so wrong. So like MSN, this is how they describing this situation. They said, well, Vladimir Putin's mBridge under fire. BIS weighs shutting down BRICS threat to dollar. I don't think mBridge has anything to do with Putin. He didn't set it up.
No.
It was China, Thailand, and UAE's central bank and Hong Kong. And I think this year Saudi joined mainly for CBDC exchange. The only thing related to that from BRICS side is BRICS is thinking have some kind of BRICS bridge similar to mBridge, but it's not Putin's mBridge at all.
No.
So
no.
Here's my question. Now, Bank of International Settlements, BIS, is a bank for central banks around the world. So it's a very, very important bank, and it's part of the Switzerland, banking industry. Why do they do something like that to discredit themselves? When you do something like that, people can no longer trust you, isn't it?
You are absolutely correct, and it's incredibly wrong, and it's incredibly stupid. Even during the Second World War, the BIS continued to function with American and German representatives. So, I mean, the German and American central banks and the British central bank were all working in BIS during the Second World War, because that was what the BIS saw its role as being in those days. It was completely neutral. It functioned in Switzerland. Its responsibility was to the global financial system. It was not going to work on behalf of one side or another. But today, it's different. I mean, Swiss neutrality, I think, has almost gone up in smoke, if I have to be honest, which is a tragedy and a great shame from many points of view. I mean, people can be scornful and mocking of the Swiss in the past, and there can be all kinds of cynical things said about them. But I think Swiss neutrality overall had a good role to play. And I have personal reasons for thinking that, by the way, which I don't want to discuss in this program. But that's all gone. They've clearly been leaned on by the Americans to close this down. And let me repeat again, they may talk about Putin, but ultimately it is always China that is at the core of everything. And all that's going to happen now is that, as we saw in Kazan, they're busy setting up an alternative, as of course they can.
Yeah, instead of in the future, if they want to set up things like that, instead of doing that in the BIS, they probably would do it in Shanghai and Hong Kong, those sort of places. Yeah, more reliable places. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
Another thing, talking about Switzerland and neutrality thing, is that they also signed a European Sky Shield initiative. Now, they always say it's for defense, right? They always say that, but fundamentally it's a military alliance. So I think in April, we talked about this, in April, the Swiss People's Party, SVP, they actually, I think, submitted a referendum request. They want to have a referendum about the Switzerland's neutrality. Clearly, for the SVP, they feel strongly they want to have continuing the neutrality policy. So that's why they have this, they want to have a referendum to put in constitution what you can or cannot do being a neutral country. I don't know what happened with that. I can't find anything about this referendum, whether it happened or not. Probably haven't happened. But in any event, well, this is going on, supposedly a referendum is going to happen. The current Switzerland administration just doing everything, totally abandon this neutrality policies now, isn't it?
This is exactly correct. That's exactly what they're doing. Now, I haven't heard about this referendum. I heard that there were proposals for a referendum,
That
but I'm going to make a prediction. It will never happen, even if most people in Switzerland want it. And the reason it will never happen is because the Swiss people remain deeply committed to Swiss neutrality. But of course, their political class no longer is. The political class conceives of itself as very much part of the collective West, and they will resist any attempt to hold a referendum that will constrain in any way what Switzerland is going to do. And the thing about Switzerland is, of course, the political class of Switzerland still claims that Switzerland is neutral. They still want to preserve the form of neutrality while stripping all the content away. But the Russians have already straightforwardly said that they no longer think of Switzerland as a neutral country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's before long most countries in the world will come to the same view.
Yeah, I think this referendum actually is the party, the SVP, they want to continue this policy. So they want the people to have a referendum so that people show their support for the neutrality so that they can limit the government, what they can or cannot do, being a neutral country. I think that's the purpose of this.
I know, absolutely. So, and then, and the reason it's not going to happen is because if it did happen, the people would support this referendum. So for that reason, they're going to prevent it. And they're going. You can already see what they're going to say. As I said, the political class says we're neutral anyway. So why do we need this referendum?
Yeah. That's probably what is going on right now, because they submitted in April and we don't see anything, right? So because nobody wanted to follow up and nobody wanted to happen. So that's probably what's going on. Well, but then again, my question is this, like, Switzerland is doing this to undermine its own credibility, its own very important sector, the banking sector, right? And it's not that long ago, ASML, which is a Dutch company, sanctioned China based on what US asked them to do, also hurting itself. And of course, you're just talking about Germany doing all sort of self-destructive things. Why can't they get together? I understand they are small, like Switzerland and Holland, they are smaller countries. But why don't they get together with Germany and have a good conversation with the United States? Because these things are not just putting tariffs on something, Chinese goods. These are undermining their fundamental country's core businesses. So it's vital for them to resist, right? So if they cannot resist, why don't they get together and have a good conversation with the US saying, you see, you ask us to do these things that is hurting us and it's not necessarily helping you in the long run. But nobody wants to take the lead to have that conversation.
This is you've asked me a question, and it's a question that brings up the sort of sense of despair I have in Europe. The only way I can explain it is that we have a political class that isn't just in Switzerland and Netherlands and whatever, but it's a European political class, which has now become very, very rigid in its thinking, and which has become very, very, it feels very much connected to the American project. And they see anything like that as a kind of betrayal of the overall idealistic Western collectivist project. I think the thing to say about this is that for every Gerhard Schröder that there might be in Germany, and in the political system, and this reproduces itself right across the entire political system in Europe now. For every Gerhard Schröder, there are 20 Annalena Baerbocks. And that is what one has to face. So you come up against people like that all the time. And they have this very powerful demagogic language that they use. And of course, it's backed strongly by a very, very powerful Atlanticist media. Putin made an absolutely valid point, by the way, which is that in pretty much every single important media outlet in Europe today, if you drill down far enough, you will find an American NGO or think tank or business person or entity that ultimately puts up the money and, decides the line that should be followed. And, they will always say, if you deviate, if you don't agree to follow these sanctions, you are supporting China, you are undermining the West, you're siding with the autocrats against the Democrats. All this stupid narrative that has been imposed on us, but which some of these people do believe in. I think that's the other thing to say. I mean, for them, it's, they see it as somehow immoral to actually conduct trade and business in that kind of way. Again, I'm more familiar with the Russian side, but Russian officials have said, and I've heard this, but they said in private discussions that one of the major problems they have talking to Western, to European officials now, is that whenever they do, it's quite obvious that the European officials hate them. I mean, when you are faced with that, what can you do?
Yeah, they hate Russia and they are not comfortable with China.
Yeah,
You see, that's
exactly.
Yeah. So that when you have that kind of emotional, people are very emotional, right? That there are lots of the people are not very logical, not analytical. They're very emotional. Yeah. So, here's talking about media. So Reuters has this article about what's going to happen with the North Korea troops. Okay, I find it fascinating. Here's what it says. It says, no new limits on Ukraine's use of US weapons if North Korea enters fight, Pentagon says. So it took me a while to try to figure out what it's trying to say. What it's actually trying to say is, even though North Korea joined the fight, we are still going to hold whatever the limit we have for our weapons, what you can or cannot do. That's actually what it is trying to say, isn't it? Which actually is not what Ukraine want to hear. Is that what it is?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, this is exactly an example of the way in which language is being abused in the West. Because, in fact, I mean, the key word that's inserted in that sentence is new. You're the only person, by the way, that has really noticed this that I'm aware of. But the point is that what they're basically saying is that the presence of the North Koreans is going to change anything in the way in which the Western acts. They're not going to introduce restrictions above those restrictions which exist already.
Yeah. Which I thought that Ukraine would say, oh, you see, the North Korean are coming in. Now we can use your weapon for this and that. But the Pentagon essentially saying no, right? That's what this is about. But when you read it, it took me a while to figure out what it's trying to say.
Yes.
I find it very interesting. Okay. Regarding Ukraine, so let's talk about this Financial Times article, right? That it says inside Donald Trump's plan for the world. It says a lot of things in there. First of all, what's your general impression about this article? How reliable you think of the things in there said?
Right. Well, I'm going to say this. I have inside knowledge about this. Somebody who is or claims to be close to the Trump campaign actually contacted me some months ago, and this person said to me, "This isn't Donald Trump's plan." In fact, Donald Trump was presented with this plan by some of the people who work for him, and he looked at it and he put it aside, but that he's got actually quite different ideas which are not really as detailed, but are more about trying to find some means to take the tension out of the relationship with Russia. So I think that is probably true, because when you actually read the Financial Times article very carefully, it's about the same plan that we learnt about back in August, early September, which was presented to Trump at that time. There was no word that Trump himself had adopted it at that time. And if you read the Financial Times article carefully, it doesn't say that he's adopted it now. It's just a plan that some people have come up with. Now, the plan itself is unworkable. I mean, the Russians won't accept it. The Ukrainians won't accept it. The Europeans can't implement it. So it's an idea that's been put together by some people in Trump's entourage, very hawkish, neocon inclined people. And basically, I think it's a mechanism to try to keep the war going rather than anything else. But I don't think that Trump himself is really very interested in it or is going to feel tied down to it in any way.
So we still don't know what Trump's plan really is, right? Even though he said that 24 hours he could end the war, but we don't know what he has in mind. No.
Well, I can tell you straight away what he has in mind, which is nothing. I don't think he has a plan. I think anybody who thinks that Donald Trump has a plan is deceiving themselves. I mean, Trump doesn't want the United States. I think this is genuine. He doesn't want the United States drawn into a war in Ukraine. He is also somebody who feels that the whole Ukraine thing was a terribly mismanaged affair, which isn't profitable for the United States, at least not any longer. I mean, he is somebody who tends to look at everything in a very profit and loss sort of way. I mean, I don't think but I don't think he's got any serious ideas or plans about how to end the Ukraine war. And when has he ever come up with any kind of plan of that kind?
Now, how about the Middle East? That article also said that Trump believed he could pressure Netanyahu to come to the table, to come to some kind of a consensus with the other parties. There is, Hezbollah, and then of course the Lebanon, all sort of people in different factions, different parties in Middle East. Do you think he could do that? Do you even think he wants to do that?
No, I don't. I'm not convinced, actually. I mean, again, where Trump is concerned, I mean, he's clearly going to be very conflicted. I mean, his instinctive feelings are not only very strongly pro-Israeli, but he has a long-term, very close friendship with Netanyahu. He's also recently spoken to Netanyahu. I can't really see him putting pressure on Netanyahu in the way that the article seems to suggest. Probably he thinks that because they're friends, Netanyahu will listen to him. What I think is true is that Trump doesn't want a war with Iran. And J.D. Vance, his vice president, has just said that. And that is going to create tensions within the Trump administration, if we ever have a second Trump administration. It's not happened yet. But if we ever do, there are going to be internal tensions on how to deal with the situation in the Middle East. There's going to be internal tensions about how to deal with the situation in Ukraine. It is a mistake to think that Trump has plans to solve either of these problems, or that he has the political, clarity to do what must be done in order to bring them to an end.
I feel about Trump too. I think he has some good ideas, and he probably can estimate, assess the situation better than Harris and Biden. But I'm not sure he can do the right thing. And he himself, actually, recently he had this long interview with Joe Rogan, like 3 hours. He admitted that. He said his biggest mistake is he hired some really bad people into his administration. I think he referred to, what I think a horrible person like a John Bolton, right? Pompeo, that kind of people. But I don't know whether that's what he's referring to. But in any event, I'm not confident that he will this time, do things differently. That's my concern.
No, I don't think any of us is. The one thing I would say about that, and that, by the way, I thought was the most important thing that Trump said across that entire interview, is that it is very unusual in any country in the West now for a politician to admit a mistake.
Yeah.
And he did admit a mistake, an important one. And that may suggest that he's going to be a little bit more careful who he chooses this time. Certainly, he does seem to have a stronger team this time than the one he did in 2016, which was, just put it mildly, we didn't want barely a team at all, actually.
Yeah. Well, speaking of election, there are already cases has been reported, like ballot boxes being burned down. Right, it's already chaos is already broke because they have this early voting thing. So their voting is going on right now, and so does seems confusions, and in some cases maybe even, I don't know, sabotage is going on. So are we going to have a smooth election? I mean,
well, I don't think so. And I mean, the rhetoric now is completely out of control. I mean, the Democrat. I mean, again, I mean, it's astonishing that people are talking this way after 2 assassination attempts on Trump. But again, we're hearing about how he's, a fascist. I mean, it's now been straightforwardly said that he's a fascist, that he's a threat to democracy, that he's a threat to America. I mean, when rhetoric reaches these kind of levels, then it becomes almost a matter of honor to rig the election, to try to stop Trump being elected, and if that doesn't work, even to kill him. I mean, it's I think people underestimate how dangerous this sort of rhetoric actually is.
Yeah, I agree. I also feel like it's very hateful, and I recently had a wedding to attend the last weekend. I mean, the people there, I know they're very pro Harris and Biden people, so I keep my mouth shut, even though I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not, but in some people's view, even you supported Jill Stein, the third party, they hate you for that because you are helping Trump when you do that. That's how they interpret that. So, I mean, in my case, if I'm not voting third party, I'm not voting for Harris either. So it's not like I'm helping Trump. So
I know.
Anyway, yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
One more thing is Jeff Bezos recently got lots of heat because supposedly he blocked a editorial board to endorse from endorsing Harris. So I have two questions about that. First of all, why is this such a big deal? I mean, of course, a billionaire owns a news outlet. That's nothing new. He's not the only one. And if you own it, of course, you have influence over it. And I didn't see they totally, everybody was shocked by like the Twitter file or Facebook even admitted, Zuckerberg admitted that the U.S. government, the FBI told them directly, what you can or cannot do. You have to get rid of some of the accounts, and you cannot publish this and that story. Nobody was reacting this way just because he apparently interfered. So why is this such a big deal? Just because they don't like him not to endorse Harris? Is that what it is?
Because it's seen again as helping Donald Trump. It comes back to the point that you've just made. Anything that appears that works to try to stop Donald Trump is not only permitted but encouraged. It's supported. Anything that might conceivably help Donald Trump is by definition wrong and illegitimate. I mean, that's the kind of mindset that now prevails today. So, if Zuckerberg does something which ultimately is supportive of the Democrats, of Harris or Biden, or that kind of thing, well, that's fine, because these are good, respectable, democratic people. They support our way and our thinking and all of that. If, on the other hand, Bezos comes along and he's worried that, the Washington Post is losing credibility, which it is, by the way, and losing readers, which it also is, and it's becoming a major drain on his resources, which it is also, and decides, well, I've got to do something to bring that to a stop, and that means not endorsing Harris and perhaps being prepared to have some more conservative people come on board. Shock, horror, that's betrayal. That's the end of the world. That just proves that, Bezos is a fascist as well. There are, today, by the way, the media here in London, which is effectively an outpost of the American media in this kind of thing. Even more so, it's able to say things that the American media still doesn't quite say. Anyway, it's now basically saying that all the plutocrats and oligarchs are now lining up behind Trump. And that's a further proof of what a dangerous fascist Trump ultimately is.
Yeah. I also feel like this whole thing about endorsement. I actually think now, personally, I don't like
Mm.
Jeff Bezos at all. I mean,
No.
there's all kinds of awful things he's done. I can't, stomach. But on this matter, I think not to endorse anybody. I actually
Mm.
think it's the correct thing to do because newspaper, I always have a problem. Newspaper editorial board, they would endorse this and that candidate. What they
Mm.
essentially telling us is we, the readers, should listen to them and vote the way they want us to vote. Isn't the newspaper's purpose is to tell us what happened and let us to decide who we want to vote for,
I
right?
completely agree with you. I find the whole idea of endorsing candidates by
Yeah,
newspapers an absurd one. It
yeah.
didn't used to exist when I was first started reading newspapers. I remember I lived through elections in Britain going all the way back to the one in 1970. So I mean, in those days, newspapers did not endorse candidates. Now
Yeah,
they do that as a matter of routine.
yeah.
I'm talking about Britain. I mean, in the
Mhm.
United States, it might have been different. But I agree. I mean, newspapers, their purpose was to report the news, to inform. You would have commentary. You would have the editorial. And
Mhm.
then you would have the op-ed, in which more often than not, you would choose somebody, a commentator, who would argue against the editorial. That was how the old system worked. And I thought it was a good one, but all that's gone out of the way now. Now, of course, because it's the future of democracy that's at stake, we have to all take sides, and newspapers must do so, and so must their owners. And if they
And
take the wrong sides, then they must be thrown into the outer darkness.
and that's the conversation I had with one of the, my friend. I was like, no, I don't like Jeff Bezos. And then, what
Mm,
he's doing clearly is
yeah,
interfering with, newspapers, its own standing, what have you. But why would anybody endorse, right?
yeah,
The editorial board. My friend's argument is, well, they have been doing that for years. That is a long tradition, blah, blah. But I
yeah.
said, well, long tradition is probably it's a wrong tradition. We should change
Well,
that.
correct. And coming back to Jeff Bezos, I should say straight away, I don't like him either. He has done far more things that are far, far worse than not endorsing Kamala Harris.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary that, as I say, people who up to now have been completely uncritical of Bezos, even as he's done things to his workers, which, one really shouldn't do. Suddenly they discover that he's a terrible man and an oligarch and all of that kind of thing, simply because he won't allow the Washington Post to pass an editorial saying that Kamala Harris is the person we should all vote for. I mean, it
Mhm.
tells you an awful lot about the warped nature of political debate in the West today.
Yeah. And speaking of, you're mentioning the British newspaper saying all these oligarchies are lining up behind the Trump. I recently made an episode to my Chinese audience
Mm,
to map out who is behind which
mm,
candidate. Kamala Harris has a lot of billionaires behind her. I would say pretty
mm,
much the whole Silicon Valley high tech
mm,
executive. They were all behind her, except the so-called PayPal mafia. The
yeah,
Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and then David Sachs. These are the so-called
yeah,
PayPal mafia. Now these are the people behind Trump, but the rest of them they were all behind Kamala. And
yeah,
then my viewers, some of my viewers pointed out that the PayPal mafia actually are very anti-China. And the
yeah.
reason they're anti-China is because they were trying to get into the Chinese market. They couldn't. So that's just something I want to share with you. I find
Well,
interesting.
that is very interesting, and that explains a great deal, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Because I
Mm,
told you I was complaining that David Sachs, has been I feel he has been anti-China. Now Elon Musk himself probably is not because he has
no,
still business in China.
yeah,
But Peter Thiel I think is also very anti-China. David Sachs
interesting.
is. Yeah, yeah,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
Well, that explains a great deal, of course. And Peter Thiel has this connection with JD Vance, which was
Uh-huh.
also very interesting. Yeah. Well, that although that is very, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, I learned that from my audience that they were,
yeah.
and then I looked it
Yeah.
up. It's true that they were
Yeah.
trying pretty hard to get into China, but couldn't.
Mm,
Now, China in general, anything related to financial services, PayPal is regarded a kind of a financial services. They're very, very careful, and they have
yeah.
stricter regulation. Although
The,
I
the,
think, yeah, although I
the,
think that they are loosening up a little bit now. I think so.
They're absolutely right to be very, very careful, if I may say. A friend of mine who was a banker said that, banks and financial institutions from outside can act as black holes inside your economy.
Without even you notice. Many times you don't even notice. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, this person was Russian, and the difficulty the Russians have had bringing their financial system under control, since which they've only really started to do after 2014, have been enormous. And there's a lot of comments and criticisms that you sometimes find made even in Russia by all sorts of sovereignist people of Nabulina, the chair of the central bank. But one of the things they all overlook is that she has done incredible work, very, very hard work, bringing, as I said, the financial system in Russia under control. And that included closing down something like 2/3 of the country's banks.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it explains that China is always very careful. And that's the criticism. Lots of the Western bankers against China is because China is too strict in this area. So they couldn't easily go in and grab all the money. And, that's part of the people. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's all I have. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, so it's always interesting talking to you. Yeah.
And a pleasure to speak to you again. And we'll be speaking hopefully from China next week, or you'll be in China next week.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to that too.
Me too.
Have a great week, Sophia.
You too. Bye.
Bye.